She was on her knees on the cold marble floor. Her hands were shaking. Not from guilt. From shock. The little boy she had spent 2 years loving like her own blood was lying at the bottom of the grand staircase, motionless, pale, barely breathing, and everyone in that house was looking at her like she had put him there. She hadn't touched him. She hadn't even been in the room. But try telling that to a billionaire father who had just walked through his front door to find his only son unconscious on the floor, and his nanny standing over him with tears streaming down her face and no explanation that made any sense. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait. He just looked at her with eyes that had once trusted her with everything, and said 4 words that shattered the air between them like glass. "Get out of my house." And that was it. 2 years of loyalty, 2 years of love, 2 years of being the first face that little boy wanted to see every morning, erased in 4 seconds by a man who chose assumption over truth. But here is what nobody in that house knew yet. Not the father, not the staff, not the paramedics who were already rushing through the front door. That little boy on the floor. He had seen everything. And when he woke up, he was going to change everything. Her name was Petra Delacroix. 31 years old, quietly brilliant, patient in the way that only people who have known real hardship can be patient. She had grown up in a small town in Georgia where money was never the question, survival was. Her mother had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years without complaint, and Petra had watched her do it with a dignity so unshakable it had carved itself permanently into her daughter's character. Petra didn't become a nanny because she couldn't do anything else. She became a nanny because she understood something most people don't, that the most important years of a child's life happen before anyone is paying attention, that the voice a child hears at 3 in the morning when they are afraid shapes the voice they carry inside themselves for the rest of their lives. She believed that completely. And Benji Ashworth had proven her right. Benjamin Ashworth Benji, as everyone called him, was 7 years old, gap-toothed, wildly imaginative, and the kind of child who asked questions that made adults go quiet. "Petra, if the sky is so big, why does it feel small sometimes?" "Petra, does missing someone hurt the same way a bruise hurts?" "Petra, do you think my mum can still hear me even though she's in heaven?" That last one had made Petra sit down on the floor right beside him in the middle of the kitchen and hold his small hand for a very long time before she found the right words. Benji's mother, Callum Ashworth's wife, Rosalind, had died of a sudden brain aneurysm 18 months before Petra arrived at the house. Benji had been 5, old enough to understand that she was gone, too young to understand why. Callum Ashworth had been completely destroyed by it. Callum Ashworth was 38, the founder and CEO of Ashworth Capital, a private equity firm that managed over $4 billion in assets across 3 continents. He had built the company from a single rented office and a second-hand desk when he was 24. He was the kind of man who made decisions that moved markets, who sat across from governments and held his nerve, who had been described by 3 different financial publications in the same year as the most composed man in any room he enters. But grief had found the cracks in his composure and pulled them apart completely. After Rosalind died, he had barely functioned for 6 months. He had gone through 3 nannies in that time, not because he was cruel, but because Benji had been so devastated, so withdrawn, so determined to reject anyone who tried to fill the space his mother had left, that the nannies had eventually, one by one, given up. Then Petra arrived. She hadn't tried to fill the space. She had simply sat beside it with him. She had let Benji grieve. She had let him cry at unexpected moments without rushing to stop the tears. She had kept a small framed photograph of Rosalind on the bookshelf in his bedroom, not hidden, not forced, just present, and she had spoken about his mother naturally, warmly, like someone who deserved to still be part of the conversation. Within 3 months, Benji had stopped waking up screaming at night. Within 5 months, he had started smiling again, really smiling, the full-face kind that reached his eyes. Within a year, he had started calling Petra his best friend. Callum had noticed all of it. He had been grateful in the way that people who have almost lost everything are grateful, quietly, deeply, in a way that goes beyond words. He had given Petra a significant salary increase after the first year without her asking. He had made sure she had her own beautiful suite in the east wing of the house. He had treated her, by every measure, with genuine respect. And Petra had returned that trust with everything she had. The trouble began 8 months before the day everything fell apart. Her name was Sabine Voss. She had arrived in Callum's life the way certain people do, at exactly the right moment of vulnerability, with exactly the right amount of charm. She was a 35-year-old art consultant, tall, effortlessly polished, European-educated, with the kind of easy confidence that fills a room without trying. She had been introduced to Callum at a charity auction. She had made him laugh for the first time in over 2 years. He had called her the next morning. Petra had said nothing when Callum brought Sabine home for the first time. She had simply smiled, shaken her hand, and quietly watched. Because something about Sabine Voss made the back of Petra's neck tight, in a way she could not immediately explain. It wasn't jealousy. Petra had no romantic feelings for Callum. She was professional to the bone, and that boundary had never moved a millimeter in 2 years. It was something else. Something in the way Sabine looked at Benji. Not with warmth, not with hostility either. She was far too careful for anything as obvious as hostility. It was more like indifference worn as warmth, like someone performing the correct facial expression without generating the correct feeling behind it. Benji, for his part, had been polite but distant. Children know things. They don't always have the language for what they know, but the knowing itself lives in them like an instinct, quiet, persistent, accurate. Benji had never reached for Sabine's hand. He had never climbed into her lap. He had never saved her a biscuit from the tin the way he saved one for Petra every single afternoon without fail. He had been polite. And that was all. Sabine had noticed. The first sign came 6 months into the relationship. When Sabine had arrived at the house on a Tuesday afternoon, unexpected, unannounced, and found Petra and Benji in the garden, lying on their backs in the grass, staring at cloud shapes and laughing about something. Sabine had stood at the French doors, watching them for a long moment. She had said nothing. But later that evening, when Petra had passed by the study door on her way upstairs, she had heard Sabine's voice through the gap, soft and measured, but deliberate. "Don't you think Benji is becoming a bit too dependent on her, darling? A child his age needs to be building broader relationships. It might actually be holding him back." Petra had not stopped walking. She had kept her face calm, her pace steady, and she had gone up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, breathing carefully. She had told herself it was nothing. She had been wrong. Over the following weeks, Sabine began to find small, careful ways to position herself between Petra and Benji. She would suggest outings on Petra's days off, trips to museums, lunches at restaurants, and then casually mention them in front of Benji before Callum had confirmed anything, so that if they didn't happen, the disappointment landed somewhere other than her. She would appear at bedtime, which had always been Petra and Benji's quiet ritual, a chapter of a book, a glass of warm milk, a short conversation about the day, and insert herself with a brightness so deliberate it felt like an interruption dressed as enthusiasm. She began offering opinions on Benji's schedule, his diet, his screen time, his friendships at school. None of it was asked for. All of it was delivered in the pleasant, reasonable tone of someone who simply cared. Callum, still raw from grief, still grateful for Sabine's presence in his life, listened. He didn't see what Petra saw. And then Sabine moved into the house. It happened gradually, first a weekend bag, then a wardrobe rail in the master's suite, then a key. By the time it was a permanent arrangement, it had already become normal enough that questioning it felt strange. The morning after it became official, Sabine appeared in the kitchen while Petra was making Benji's breakfast. She poured herself a coffee, leaned against the counter, and looked at Petra with a smile that didn't quite reach the right part of her face. "I'm sure we'll find a wonderful rhythm," she said. Petra had said, "I'm sure we will," and turned back to the stove. But the air between them had shifted permanently. 2 weeks before the accident, something happened that Petra would replay in her mind 1,000 times afterward. She had been folding laundry in the utility room when she heard voices in the garden. She had glanced through the window and seen Sabine and Benji standing near the old stone steps that led down to the lower garden. A set of steep, narrow steps that Callum had specifically told everyone in the house was off-limits for Benji until the retaining wall beside them was repaired. Sabine had been pointing at something at the bottom of the steps. Benji had been looking down with the cautious curiosity of a child who has been told something is forbidden and is therefore fascinated by it. Petra had gone outside immediately. She had taken Benji's hand, reminded him gently but firmly about the steps, and walked him back to the house. Sabine had watched them go. She had said nothing. She had smiled. And then the day arrived. It was a Friday afternoon in October. The light was golden, and the air carried the first real cold of autumn. Callum was at the office. He was due home at 6. Petra had been in the house all morning and into the early afternoon, but at 2 o'clock she had received a call from her mother, who was 63 and had been having chest pains, and she had stepped outside to the back courtyard to take the call in private, not wanting to alarm Benji with a conversation she wasn't sure about yet. The call had lasted 14 minutes. Her mother was fine. It was anxiety, not cardiac. The doctor had confirmed it. Petra had exhaled with relief, pocketed her phone, and walked back into the house. And that is when she had found him. Benji was at the bottom of the grand staircase. Not the garden steps. The interior staircase, the wide, polished marble one that swept down from the upper landing to the entrance hall. He was face down. He wasn't moving. Petra had screamed his name and been at his side in seconds. She had not moved him. She knew not to move him. She had kept her hand on his back, felt the shallow but present rise and fall of his breathing, and called emergency services with hands that refused to stop trembling. And then Callum's car had pulled into the driveway. And Callum had walked through his front door and seen what he saw. Before we go any further into this story, I want to take just a moment to welcome you. If this is your first time here, welcome home. This is Nanny Grace Channel, a place where real, raw, deeply human stories live. Stories about love, loyalty, betrayal, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. And if you've been here before, welcome back. You already know what this channel means. If these stories speak to something inside you, if they make you feel seen or understood or less alone, I would gently invite you to subscribe, not for numbers, but so that the next story finds its way back to you. Now let's go back to Petra, because what happens next is something nobody in that house was prepared for. Callum Ashworth did not shout. That was almost worse. The men who shout are releasing something. The men who go quiet are building a wall, and they are building it fast, and it is thick, and once it is up, almost nothing gets through it. Callum had gone quiet. He had looked at Benji on the floor. He had looked at Petra on her knees beside him. He had looked at the phone in her hand, the emergency services operator still speaking through it, and he had processed the scene in the way that his mind, trained through 15 years of high-pressure decision-making, had processed 1,000 other crises. He had reached a conclusion. It was the wrong one. "What happened?" he had said. His voice was perfectly level. That was the thing about Callum Ashworth. His voice was always level. It had been a source of admiration in boardrooms. Right now, in his own entrance hall, it felt like a blade. "I don't know," Petra had said, which was the truth, and which was the worst possible thing she could have said. "You don't know." "I stepped outside to take a phone call. My mother wasn't well. I was only gone for—" "You left him." "Callum, I was in the courtyard. I was 14 minutes. You left my son alone in this house, and he fell down a flight of stairs." The paramedics had arrived then, 3 of them, efficient and focused, and the conversation had been severed by the urgent necessity of the moment. They had stabilized Benji's neck, assessed his breathing, confirmed a suspected concussion and a fractured collarbone, and had him on a stretcher and moving within 6 minutes. Callum had climbed into the ambulance without looking at Petra again. The last thing he had said to her, standing in the doorway of his house, one hand on the door frame, facing away from her, was, "Get out of my house." Where was Sabine during all of this? She had appeared at the top of the staircase, just as the paramedics were loading Benji onto the stretcher. She had looked distressed, appropriately, precisely distressed, one hand over her mouth, eyes wide, a small sound of shock that carried perfectly from the upper landing. She had descended the stairs quickly, taken Callum's arm, spoken quietly in his ear. She had glanced at Petra exactly once. And then she had gone with Callum to the hospital. Petra had stood in the entrance hall of that house for a long time after they left. She had not packed her things immediately. She had sat in the kitchen, her kitchen, the kitchen where she had made 2 years of breakfasts and birthday cakes and warm milk with honey, and she had stared at the table and tried to understand what had just happened to her. She was not angry yet. She was too shocked for anger. She replayed the 14 minutes in her mind. She had been in the courtyard, the back courtyard, visible from the kitchen window, barely 30 meters from the base of the stairs. The call had come in at 2:11. She had returned to the house at 2:25. Benji could not have fallen in the first few minutes. He had been sitting at the kitchen table drawing when she stepped outside. She had checked on him through the kitchen window at minute 3. So the fall had happened between minute 3 and minute 14. An 11-minute window. In an empty house. Was it an empty house? The question arrived in Petra's mind quietly. Then it arrived again, louder. Sabine had been in the house that afternoon. She had arrived at 1:30. Petra had opened the door for her herself. She had said she was going to work in the upstairs sitting room, the one at the far end of the east corridor that Callum had converted into a second office for her use. But the upstairs sitting room was at the opposite end of the house from the main staircase. And Sabine had appeared at the top of that main staircase the moment the paramedics arrived. Petra's mind moved through that geography slowly. The upstairs sitting room was a 4-minute walk from the top of the main staircase. Why had Sabine been near the main staircase? Why had Sabine not heard anything, not Benji's fall, not his cry, if she had been in the house? And why had Benji been at the top of the grand staircase at all? He knew the rules. He used the back staircase always. The grand staircase had always been the company staircase, Benji's word for it. He had mocked it gently once, calling it too fancy for normal humans. He would not have gone near that staircase on his own, unless someone had brought him there. Petra had been dismissed from the house before she could say any of this. She had driven to her apartment, the small 1-bedroom she kept as her own space, 20 minutes from the Ashworth estate, and she had sat in her car in the parking lot for 45 minutes, unable to go inside. Her phone rang once. It was the household manager, a quiet, efficient man named Gerald, calling to tell her, with genuine sadness in his voice, that Mr. Ashworth had instructed him to have her final month's salary processed and her personal belongings from her suite boxed and couriered to her address. She was not to return to the house. Gerald had apologized. She had heard the discomfort in his voice, the way decent people sound when they are delivering indecent instructions. She had thanked him. She had hung up. And then she had sat in her car in the dark and done something she had not done since her own most difficult years. She had cried, fully, completely, without holding any of it back. Not for herself. For Benji. Because whatever had happened in that house, whatever the truth was, that little boy was lying in a hospital bed right now, frightened and in pain, and the person he would most want to hold his hand was sitting in a parking lot 20 minutes away, having been told she no longer existed in his world. That was the cruelest part. Not the accusation. Not the dismissal. The separation from a child who needed her. 4 days passed. Benji remained in hospital for 2 of them, the concussion requiring monitoring, the collarbone immobilized in a small sling that he apparently, according to Gerald, who kept Petra quietly updated out of his own private conscience, kept calling my pirate wing. Even from a distance, through second-hand information, that small detail had made Petra exhale with something like a broken laugh. He was still himself. He was going to be all right. That had to be enough for now. But on the 3rd day, something happened inside the Ashworth house that no one had engineered and no one had anticipated. Benji came home from the hospital, and he asked for Petra. He had asked at the hospital first. Callum had told him carefully that Petra was taking some time away. Benji had accepted this with the quiet nod of a child who consents when an adult is not telling the full truth, but does not yet have the standing to challenge it. He had asked again at home. Callum had said the same thing. Benji had gone to his room, and he had drawn a picture. It was not unusual for Benji to draw after difficult experiences. Petra had always understood this about him. He processed the world through his hands. When Rosalind died, he had filled 3 notebooks with drawings before he could find the words. Petra had kept every one of them. This drawing was different. It was not abstract. It was not symbolic. It was precise. In the way that a 7-year-old's drawing is precise, not technically perfect, but emotionally accurate. The kind of drawing that depicts exactly what the child saw, without the editing that adults apply to memory. The drawing showed the grand staircase. Petra recognized it immediately from the curved shape of the railing. Benji had always drawn it with that particular curve, like a wave. At the top of the staircase, there was a small figure with brown skin and curly hair. That was Benji, drawing himself. Beside him, at the very top of those stairs, was a taller figure, long hair, a dress, a face with 2 careful dots for eyes and a straight line for a mouth. Not a warm mouth, not a smiling mouth. A flat one. Benji had drawn this figure standing very close to himself, too close, with one arm extended. Not holding his hand. Pushing. The small figure at the top of the stairs was falling. Gerald found the drawing on the kitchen table the following morning. Benji had left it there deliberately, not hidden, not explained, just present, the way Petra had always kept Rosalind's photograph. Gerald had stared at it for a very long time. He was not a dramatic man. He did not leap to conclusions. He was 61 years old and had worked in private households for 35 of those years, and he had learned that the space between what something appears to be and what it actually is can be vast and treacherous. But he was also a man of conscience. He had taken a photograph of the drawing on his phone. He had then walked very quietly to the security room, the small room off the utility corridor, where the household CCTV system operated. He had sat down at the monitor. He had reviewed the footage for Friday afternoon. The interior cameras covered the entrance hall, the kitchen, the main corridor, the back courtyard, and both staircase landings. He had gone to the 2:15 timestamp, the middle of the 11-minute window. And what he saw made a 61-year-old man who had not cried in professional circumstances in 30 years put both hands flat on the desk and breathe very carefully through his nose for a long time before he trusted himself to move. The footage showed Sabine Voss. She was at the top of the grand staircase at 2:17. She was not alone. Benji was with her, standing at the top step, looking down, the way a child looks when they have been asked to look at something specific. Sabine was standing directly behind him. The camera angle was partial. The corner of the landing cut off the full image, but what was visible was sufficient, and what was visible was this. Sabine's hand on Benji's back. Not holding him. Not steadying him. Her hand was flat, and then it was not flat, and then Benji was no longer at the top of the stairs. The footage then showed, 30 seconds later, Sabine walking calmly to the far end of the landing, away from the staircase, toward the east corridor. Away from the sound of a child falling. Away from the absence of his voice afterward. She had not run to him. She had walked away. The camera in the back courtyard showed Petra returning to the house at 2:25, 8 minutes after the fall. Petra had not been in the house. Petra had not been anywhere near that staircase. Gerald had printed the footage stills. He had called a number he had kept in his phone for 2 years, a number he had hoped he would never need to use in this context. He had called Callum Ashworth's personal mobile. "Sir," he had said when Callum answered, "I need you to come home right now, and I need you to come alone." Callum arrived home in 19 minutes. He came through the front door with the expression of a man who had been managing a crisis for 4 days, and was not sure he had the capacity for another one until he saw Gerald's face. Gerald was not a man who showed fear. In 35 years, Callum had never seen it on him. He was showing it now. Gerald placed 3 things on the kitchen table in front of Callum without speaking. The printed CCTV stills. A timeline, handwritten on a single sheet of paper. And Benji's drawing. Callum looked at the drawing first. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he looked at the CCTV stills. Gerald watched him go through them, slowly, methodically, with the focus of a man who has spent his career parsing information for truth. He watched Callum's expression move through several things in sequence, confusion, then concentrated attention, then a dawning understanding so heavy it seemed to physically press down on his shoulders, then something Gerald had never seen on Callum Ashworth's face before. Shame. Raw, unguarded, absolute shame. "Where is she?" Callum said. His voice was not level now. "I have her address, sir." "Where is Sabine?" Gerald paused. "She left this morning. She said she was going to an appointment. She took a significant amount of luggage." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing Gerald had ever heard in 35 years of quiet, well-ordered households. Callum did not chase Sabine. Not immediately. The first call he made was to his legal team. The second call was to the detective firm his company used for sensitive matters. The third call, and this one he made himself, standing alone in his study with the door closed, the CCTV footage playing silently on the screen in front of him. The third call was to Petra. It rang 4 times. She answered on the 5th. She said nothing when she heard his voice. Not a word. Just the sound of her breathing, steady, controlled, the breathing of a woman who had spent 4 days holding herself together by sheer force of character. "Petra." Silence. "I know what happened." More silence. Then, barely audible, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath, something in between, something that held 4 days of pain in a single exhale. I am, he started. Don't, she said. Her voice was quiet, not angry, just honest. Not yet, not over the phone. He had understood. Will you come back? A long pause, long enough that he thought she might say no, long enough that he would not have blamed her if she did. How is Benji? She said. He's been asking for you every day. Another pause. I'll come tomorrow morning, she said. I'll be there at 8. She had arrived at 7:45. Benji had been sitting at the kitchen table when she walked through the door. He had looked up from his bowl of cereal and gone completely still for exactly 1 second, the way children freeze when something they have been quietly, desperately hopping for suddenly becomes real in front of them, and they need a moment to trust it. Then he had climbed down from his chair. He had walked across the kitchen. He had wrapped both arms around Petra's waist, the sling on his collarbone making one arm shorter than the other, and pressed his face against her stomach and held on. She had held him back, both arms completely. She had not spoken. There was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Callum had stood in the doorway watching and said nothing either. The drawing on the table was still there. The curve of the staircase railing, the 2 figures at the top, the small body falling. What a 7-year-old child had known and carried and found his own way to tell, because no one had thought to ask him. Children know things. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. The CCTV footage, authenticated by the security company that had installed the system, was unambiguous. Sabine Voss had placed both hands on Benji's back at the top of the grand staircase at 2:17 on a Friday afternoon. The exact physical contact and the child's subsequent fall were captured in sufficient detail that, when Callum's legal team presented the footage to law enforcement, there was no procedural ambiguity. Sabine was located 3 days later at an airport hotel. She had not yet left the country. She was arrested. In questioning, the details that emerged were both calculated and pathetic in the way that most cruelty, once fully exposed, tends to be. She had not intended to kill Benji. Her defense would lean heavily on this. She had intended to injure him seriously enough that Callum's confidence in Petra would be destroyed. She had watched Petra and Benji's relationship for months with a resentment she had mistaken for reasonable concern. And she had decided, with the terrifying logic of a person who values acquisition over humanity, that the easiest way to secure her position in Callum's life was to remove the person his son loved most and manufacture a crisis that would unite father and partner in shared blame of another. A child had been collateral damage in a manipulation so cold it had taken 2 weeks for the people around it to fully believe it was real. Sabine had watched Benji fall down those stairs, and she had walked away. The legal proceedings took the better part of a year. Sabine was charged with child endangerment and criminal recklessness. Her defense was expensive and well-constructed and ultimately insufficient. She was convicted. The sentence included a period of imprisonment and a permanent restraining order. Callum did not attend the sentencing hearing. He spent that day at home, in the garden, teaching Benji to identify cloud shapes, lying on their backs in the grass, Benji's collarbone long healed, the afternoon golden the way October afternoons sometimes are. Petra was in the garden too, sitting in the wooden chair near the rose beds with a cup of tea, watching the 2 of them and feeling something she could not name precisely. Not happiness, not quite, but something quieter and more durable than happiness. Something like peace. Callum had apologized properly. Not the day of the phone call. He had understood when she said not yet. Not the morning she returned, when Benji's arms around her waist had made words feel inadequate. He had apologized 3 weeks later in the kitchen, after Benji was asleep. He had sat across the table from her with no preamble, no careful legal language, no performance. I failed you, he had said. I built 2 years of trust with you and I dissolved it in 30 seconds because it was easier to believe the worst than to ask a single question. That is not something I can justify. I can only tell you that I am sorry, genuinely, completely sorry, and that I understand if what I did permanently changed something between us." Petra had looked at him for a long time. "It did change something," she said. He had accepted that. He had not flinched from it. "But I'm still here," she said, "and Benji needs me to be here, so we move forward." She had picked up her tea. "But Callum," she had looked at him steadily, "if you ever do something like that again, you don't dismiss me. You ask. You always ask first." "Yes," he had said, quietly, completely, "always." It was not a fairy tale reconciliation. It was not dramatic or cinematic or underscored with swelling strings. It was two adults in a kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, choosing to rebuild something carefully, with eyes open. Which is the only way anything real is ever rebuilt. Benji, for his part, had healed with the breathtaking resilience that children deploy when they are held by people who love them consistently. His collarbone knitted itself back together in 8 weeks. His nightmares, which had returned briefly in the immediate aftermath, faded again within a month. He went back to asking his impossible questions. "Petra, do you think the sky is the same sky everywhere, or does each place have its own? Petra, if someone is mean to you because they're scared, does that make being mean okay? Petra, do you think my mum knows you?" That last one. She had looked at him for a moment. "I think," she had said carefully, "that any mum who loved you as much as yours did would want to know every single person who loves you now." Benji had thought about this. Then she definitely knows you, he had decided. And then he had gone back to his drawing. The kitchen had been very quiet, and the afternoon light had come through the window at exactly the right angle, and Petra had held her cup of tea with both hands and felt the weight of the past year settle, not disappear, but settle, into something she could carry without it crushing her. That was enough. That had always been enough. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't what was said, but what was never believed. Some wounds don't disappear just because someone says sorry. Think about that for a moment. Petra stayed. She came back. She chose Benji over her own pain, and she rebuilt trust with a man who had taken less than 30 seconds to destroy 2 years of it. But here is the question I need you to answer honestly. If you were Petra, a woman who gave everything to that child, who was accused without a single question, dismissed without a moment of doubt, would you have walked back through that door? Or would the memory of kneeling on that cold floor, watching the man you served with loyalty choose assumption over truth, would that memory have been too loud to forgive? And here is the second question, the harder one. Callum built an empire on reading people, on precision, on never making a decision without evidence. Yet the moment it was personal, the moment it was his own son and his own home, he became exactly the kind of man he would never tolerate in a boardroom. If you were Benji, grown up looking back, would you respect your father the same way again? I'm reading every comment. Every single one. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something true, then you already belong here. Nanny Grace Channel exists for the stories that don't get told loudly enough. The quiet ones, the painful ones, the ones where the person with the least power turns out to carry the most truth. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, not because the number matters, but because there are more stories waiting. Stories that will move you, challenge you, and sit with you long after the screen goes dark. Like this video if Petra's strength spoke to you. Leave a comment because your voice matters in this space. And subscribe because you deserve to be here for every story that comes next. Until next time, take care of your heart. And remember, the people who truly love you will never make you question it. Nanny Grace Channel. And if you think this story was shocking, wait until you see what he did when he slapped the nanny in front of his own daughter. That story is already on this channel. Watch it next.